My father was buried on a cloudy morning, the kind where the sky seems to honor the silence we don't know how to fill. I stood beside the coffin as if watching a scene from another life, far from me, far from the girl who once held his hand. Tightly on Sunday mornings, as we walked down the church aisle, all eyes were on me, as they always had been. But this time, none weighed as heavily as his absence. The whole town came to say goodbye. Not just to the pastor, but to the figure who, for many, was almost a moral pillar of the community. Speeches, prayers, formal hugs. People who barely knew my name made a point to tell me how much he was a man of faith, a leader, an example, and I listened silently, as I'd learned to do early on. Always composed, always proper, always the pastor's daughter. That's how they knew me. That's how they expected me to act, with poise, with strength, with the same serenity he showed when speaking of hope in the face of death. But inside, I was in ruins, and not just from grief, it was something deeper, a pain I couldn't yet name, but that seemed to have started long before that farewell. Returning to the house where I grew up was like stepping into a place frozen in time. The curtains still had the same soft beige tone. The furniture was arranged exactly as I remembered. The kitchen smelled of coffee, even though no one had brewed it that morning. But it was in the details that the weight lived. The framed photos with our rehearsed poses, the bookshelf filled with carefully underlined books, the old letters stored in boxes organized by date and purpose. Everything there seemed to try to keep alive the image of the man everyone said they admired, and whom I loved, yes, deeply, but who was also to me an enigma. Because my father was never cruel, but he was never approachable either. He spoke of love with eloquence from the pulpit, but at home there was always a distance, an invisible boundary. And now that he was gone, I realized how much that distance shaped who I am. Someone who feels more than she allows. Someone who learned early to stay silent. I began sorting through his belongings in an almost automatic gesture, as if folding clothes and stacking papers could bring some order to my inner chaos. That's when I found it, tucked between a worn Bible and a volume of typewritten sermons, a small notebook covered in fabric, nameless, unmarked, with edges frayed by time. It was thin, discreet, so easy to overlook. But something about it called to me, as if it whispered. I opened it carefully, and on the first page, a slanted feminine handwriting began with a sentence that chilled me. If God saw me in that moment, I don't know if he would forgive me. But it was there that I knew what it was to love. I read those words without knowing who they came from, but instinctively knowing they'd been hidden there for a reason. This wasn't just any diary. It was a secret, a piece of a story untold in sermons, a voice that might never have been heard in life, and for some reason I couldn't explain. I felt responsible for hearing it now. I returned to it that same night, to the diary, to the words that seemed to have crossed decades just to land in my hands. I read the first pages with the reverence of touching something sacred, but also with the anxiety of someone who senses they're about to uncover something that could change how they see the world and themselves. The author never identified herself, but there was so much soul in every sentence that it felt like I already knew her. She spoke of an impossible love, of hidden meetings, of hands seeking each other in the shadows of a faith that forbade more than it embraced. She spoke of guilt, yes, but also of desire, of forced silence, of a love that had no place at the altar, but bloomed anyway, in the cracks of a religious routine. The more I read, the more I saw myself there, not in the circumstances, but in the stifled feelings, in the need to hide what pulses, in the pain of choosing between being accepted and being whole. This was more than an old account. It was a mirror. In the days that followed, I carried the diary with me everywhere in the house. Each time I sat to read, I discovered something new, a forgotten memory, a growing suspicion, a question that wouldn't stay quiet. Who wrote this? Was it someone from the community? Someone close to our family? My mother? The hypothesis haunted me, and at the same time pulled me to a place of compassion I'd never accessed toward her. Mom was always sweet, but distant, always present, but on another frequency. And if there was a hidden story in her, maybe that explained so much. It was during a quick trip to the town grocery, more to breathe than out of need, that I heard my name called by a familiar voice. I turned and saw him. Caleb. Time had passed, yes. His features were more defined, his hair shorter, his gaze more serious, but there was something undeniably him there, as if the curious boy still lingered behind that reserved posture. He smiled when he saw me, and I felt an unexpected warmth in my face. It wasn't exactly shyness. It was surprise. The kind of surprise the heart recognizes before the mind. We talked for a few minutes, exchanged the typical courtesies of reunions, vague questions, polite answers. He too had returned to town, for a while, he said, helping care for a sick uncle's property. But there was something more in that encounter, an unspoken space, a question that hung in the air and didn't have the courage to form. I went, home with an almost empty bag but a full chest. There was something in his gaze that reached me, something that seemed to say, I didn't come back whole either. I couldn't leave the diary alone anymore. It was as if each page tugged at me from within, as if the woman who wrote it were whispering to me, begging me not to let her fade between the dusty pages of a closed Bible. And I obeyed. I read in the morning before the sun warmed the windows. I read at night under the faint light of the old lamp in the room that was once mine. Each entry brought more questions. The woman spoke of a man tied to the church, someone respected but forbidden. She didn't name names but described his hands with such intimate detail, the restrained gestures during services, the glances averted in empty hallways. It was all so real, painful. Her devotion to love and sin intertwined in a rhythm I recognized, even without ever having lived it. And then, in a passage tucked between theological reflections and biblical metaphors, she wrote, He said, love and faith couldn't live in the same house. But every time he looked at me, it was as if the heavens opened just for us. I closed the diary with my breath caught. For the first time, what I read didn't just make me curious. It made me restless. Seeing Caleb again only intensified this. He showed up at the community church class, where I, at a neighbor's insistence, had agreed to help with organization. When I saw him there, seated in the back with that same silent, attentive gaze, something inside me lit up and at the same time shrank, as if I'd been caught feeling something I shouldn't. We talked again, with more ease this time. We spoke about the school we attended, about who stayed in town and who left. He mentioned losing his father a few years ago. He spoke of it in a low voice, and I saw in his eyes a mirror of what mine held. Recognizing pain in another has a strange way of drawing you closer. It's not affection, exactly. It's intimacy, the kind that doesn't need explaining. That night, back home, I sat on my bedroom floor and opened the diary again. The words were waiting. The author now spoke of the fear of being discovered, of the weight of carrying a love no one could know, of how the simple touch of his hand in prayer was enough to shake the world she pretended to live in. And for the first time I wondered, what did my father know of all this? What did my mother, so quiet, so absent, carry in her chest without ever saying? And why now, as I read this, did my mind insist on tying some gestures I saw in childhood, to faces I never wanted to look at closely. I closed the diary, leaned my head against the wall, and realized that what I'd found wasn't just an old secret. It was a fissure, and through it, the past was starting to leak with force, pushing my life toward a place I might not return from the same. I spent days trying not to think too much, trying to treat the diary as a curious find, something that deserved respect but shouldn't cross the line between memory and life. But it was too late. It had already crossed. And the more I tried to keep a safe distance from those words, the more they seeped into my own questions, my own feelings. There was something uncomfortably familiar in how that woman described the fear of feeling, the tension between faith and desire, between what's expected of us and what moves us inside. I knew what that was, even if I'd never had the courage to admit it. And worst of all, that silent tension was now starting to grow between me and Caleb. We saw each other more often. Small, casual encounters that for some reason carried the weight of confidences. A quick coffee after class, a chat outside the church, a walk through the town square market. Neither of us spoke clearly about the past, but I felt there was a story suspended between us, something unfinished when we left town, or maybe something that never got to start. Caleb listened with a kind of attention that didn't judge or surround me with spiritual advice. He just listened. And there was something so rare in that silently I began to want him more than I allowed myself to admit. Not as an escape, not as a distraction, but as presence. He looked at me as if he saw me whole, including the parts I'd learned to hide to fit the mold of the pastor's daughter. And then, one late afternoon, after another reading of the diary, I noticed a coincidence that chilled me to my core. The man described in the pages had traits that reminded me of someone from the church, subtle but unmistakable details. The way he prayed in silence, the kind of flower he left on pews without anyone knowing, the habit of jotting notes in the margins of Bible pages. Small clues that to anyone else would go unnoticed, but not to me. I grew up seeing those gestures, and though I tried to resist the conclusion, part of me already knew the man in those pages could be my father, or someone impossibly close to him. That thought knocked the ground out from under me. Suddenly it wasn't just an old diary, it was a key, a nameless confession, but too heavy to ignore. Everything I thought I knew about my parents, about what was right, about what was sin, began to crumble inside. And in the midst of it, Caleb. He with his silences, his eyes that sought me, his way of treating me as if I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. It was too dangerous, too soon, but also too late to deny. I'd like to say I kept my clarity, that I managed to separate memory from desire, but I'd be lying. Because every time I read a passage from the diary, something inside me answered, as if that woman, with her contained pain and silent courage, were pushing my body toward the life she couldn't live. Her words started to blur with mine, and frighteningly, I began to feel I was continuing the story she was forced to hide. My encounters with Caleb were no longer just encounters. There was a living tension between us, as if one misplaced gesture could make everything overflow. And yet, he was always respectful, cautious. But his eyes said what his mouth didn't, and I recognized that silence. It was the same I'd read so many times in the diary, the same kind of silence that protects what's too true to be exposed. One night, after a long walk down the main street, we stopped in front of the house where I spent my entire childhood. I mentioned the tree my father planted in his first year as pastor. Caleb smiled and said he remembered that he'd passed by there many times as a boy trying to find his place between what he felt and what was allowed. It was the first time I heard in him the same hesitation I'd always lived with, and before the silence swallowed us, he asked, "Do you believe we can be two things at once? Faithful and true?" I didn't answer. I just looked at him. And in that look, he understood. Because I too was trying to be both. I went home with my eyes burning. I opened the diary and read nearly half of it in one go. The author spoke of the guilt of loving someone she couldn't, but also of how that love transformed her, of how it made her question everything, including her image of God. "If loving is a mistake, may He correct me with mercy," she wrote. "But if loving is a miracle, then let me not miss the chance to live it." I closed the diary with trembling hands. The pieces were falling into place with cruel precision. The handwriting, the details, the dates. The author could only be my mother, and the man wasn't my father. And that in itself opened a wound I didn't know existed. A wound that pulsed, because now I understood my entire life was built on a broken story. A story of silence, renunciation, and a woman who smothered her own heart to keep peace at the altar. The next morning I went to the attic. I rummaged through boxes I didn't even remember existed, and I found more: letters, a folded photograph, and among them a small envelope with my mother's name written in delicate blue ink. Inside, a single sentence: "Even if we're not, remember together, you were the truest thing in me." My chest tightened. The world for a moment stopped, because in that moment I knew, with pain, but also with clarity, that my mother loved someone in secret, and that, perhaps, she spent the rest of her life paying the price for not being able to live that love. And now, it was my turn to decide what to do with the love growing silently between me and Caleb. After finding the sentence in the envelope, I spent days in silence. Not the kind that comforts, but the kind that weighs. I didn't talk to anyone. I didn't go back to church. I didn't reply to Caleb's messages, which were few but gentle, full of the care only someone who knows the value of space can offer. I needed time, not to think, but to feel, because my entire body seemed at odds with my memory. My head said it was all too much, that some things shouldn't be stirred, that my mother and father deserved rest, that I should leave things as they were. But my heart, it beat with a new clarity, as if something was, at last, being unearthed after years of emotional burial, and I began to understand that what hurt wasn't what I'd discovered, but the fact that I'd lived so long without knowing my story was also tied to someone's silent sacrifice. It was one late afternoon, rereading the diary's final pages, that something in me gave way. My mother didn't write with bitterness or guilt. She wrote with hope, as if those pages were the only place she could be whole. She wrote to not disappear. And when I understood that, I realized keeping that diary in a drawer would be betraying her a second time. Because the woman who raised me, who stayed discreet, sweet, and withdrawn, was also a passionate woman, contradictory, intense, alive. And maybe no one ever allowed her to be remembered that way. But I could. I had to. I called Caleb that same night, asked him to meet me at the place where we first saw each other after all those years. When he arrived, my body was trembling. Not from fear of being with him, but from fear of what it meant, breaking the pattern. I looked into his eyes and said without preamble, "I know who she was. I know who he was." He didn't ask for names, didn't demand explanations, just nodded as if he understood some stories reveal themselves without needing to be spoken aloud, and then, with a choked voice, I added, "And now I need to decide if I'll spend my life hiding what I feel." Like she did. He stepped closer slowly, didn't touch me, didn't try to console me, just said, "I didn't come back to ask anything of you, Anabelle, but if you want to walk with me, I won't leave." That sentence fell into me like a seed in dry soil. And in that moment I realized love doesn't need to shout to be strong. Sometimes it just needs a space where it can exist without fear. And maybe that space was starting to form there, between two people who learned late, but still in time, that living half a life isn't devotion, it's waste. The next morning, I opened all the house's windows. For the first time since the funeral, I let the light in without fear of what it might reveal. I walked through the rooms without the sense that everything was watching me with judgment. The house, once heavy, too silent, now breathed with me. Not because the past had changed, but because I'd stopped fearing it. I realized I didn't need to protect my father's memory or hide my mother's truth. They lived as they knew how, within the limits of their time. And I needed to live differently. I took the diary with steady hands. I read the final. Pages like someone reading a secret testament, left not to instruct, but to liberate. And that's what she did. She set me free. In the last entry, my mother wrote with simple words that seemed to break through all my inner walls. If my daughter ever finds these words, may she know that living love, even for a moment, is better than spending a lifetime fearing to be seen. I cried like I'd never cried, not for grief, not for guilt, not for pain. I cried for all she didn't live, and for all that now, with trembling hands, I finally allowed myself to live. I saw Caleb again days later. We didn't plan it. It was as if our paths were learning to align. He was leaning against the church fence, as if waiting for time to pass, or for someone to return. When he saw me, he didn't smile, just looked at me with that silence full of presence. I approached slowly, feeling the lightness of the gesture more than any overwhelming emotion. And there, without further words, he extended his hand. I took it, and I didn't let go. In that touch there were no promises, no urgency, no fantasy, just a quiet truth that after everything, after so many inherited renunciations, I was finally choosing to live for myself, choosing to feel, choosing to love. It didn't take long for the town to start talking. They didn't need many facts, just lingering looks and hands held at the wrong moment. Some smiles became tighter. Some conversations stopped when I approached. Small signs, subtle enough not to be said aloud, but clear enough to be understood. The pastor's daughter with him, and though no one said it directly, I knew. I grew up there. I knew how judgment dresses as concern, how others' love becomes a prayer topic when it escapes the box of convenience. But for the first time, it didn't paralyze me. Caleb noticed. He never complained. But sometimes I saw, in the way he sighed deeper when passing someone familiar, that he felt the weight of being where he shouldn't. In another phase of my life, that discomfort would have made me retreat. But now, I knew the problem wasn't loving. It was pretending not to love just to be accepted, and I was tired of pretending. It was on a Sunday morning, seated in the second-to-last pew of the church, where my father preached for years, that the final decision began to form within me with clarity. The current pastor spoke of grace, of how God knows our hearts, and as he spoke, I looked around and saw the contrast between what's said and what's lived. I saw couples keeping up appearances, children smiling at parents with distant eyes, women holding the hands of cold husbands just to keep the picture complete. I understood there that the faith I inherited wasn't fragile. It was just incomplete. And now I could continue that construction my way. After the service, I walked with Caleb through the square, where some greeted us formally and others averted their eyes. He squeezed my hand and asked if I was okay. I said I didn't know what okay was, but I knew I wasn't living in fear anymore, and that was already more than I'd had for years. I returned to the diary one last time, not to seek answers, but to give thanks. I sat in the same corner of the room where I'd so often read with my heart racing, and this time, what I felt was peace. I revisited the marked passages, reread words that once hurt and now seemed to embrace. My mother never had the chance to live what I'm living now, but somehow she planted the courage that sustains me today. She left her story hidden among sacred pages, and it was there that I found my freedom. I decided to write in the final pages, not to restart her story, but to finish mine. I wrote as a daughter, as a woman, as someone who for years feared being seen and now had nothing left to hide. I wrote, "I understand you now, and I promise I won't stay silent. The love you kept in silence, I choose to live out loud." I stored the diary in a linen-lined box and took it home, not to hide it again, but to keep it where it belongs, beside the woman who, today, lives without fear. Caleb was waiting on the porch with a cup of coffee and that quiet look that always says more than any poem. I sat beside him and rested my head on his shoulder. In that small, whole gesture, I understood I didn't need anyone else to validate my path. Not the town, not the memories, not the ghosts. Some people kept staring, others began to smile more sincerely, and many others simply stopped mattering. Because the truth is, when you live wholly, the world splits between those who understand and those who resist. But the peace of being who you are is worth more than all the applause combined. Today, I'm no longer just the pastor's daughter. I'm the woman who chose to love, who chose to live, and who, in the pages of a forgotten diary, found not just a secret, but permission. I don't know if my mother imagined I'd one day find her words. Maybe she wrote just to bear what she couldn't live. But by reading them, I found a piece of myself that was lost, or maybe never existed until then. Today, the diary sits on my shelf, not as a shameful relic, but as a testament that love, even when suppressed, doesn't die. It waits. Waits to be read, felt, lived. I walk through town with the same last name I've always carried, but with a different gaze. Because now I know, being the pastor's daughter doesn't stop me from being a woman, from feeling, from loving, from choosing. And if I ever have a daughter, I'll teach her that faith shouldn't cage the heart. It should strengthen it to love with courage. Love is no longer a secret. Today, it's life.